So, yeah, things have been kind of heating up over in Ukraine, ironically during the middle of winter, again. An intelligence assessment by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry claims Russia has deployed over 127,000 troops and 30 Iskander short-range ballistic missiles along its border with Ukraine. Meanwhile, Moscow and Minsk are holding joint military exercises, stoking fears in Kiev of a possible invasion from a new front, Belarus. There's also somewhere in the range of 35,000 pro-Russian separatists operating in eastern Ukraine, who, back in 2014, declared independence, establishing the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. And speaking about 2014, back when the Revolution of Dignity, sometimes also called the Maidan Revolution, was in full swing, and just days after Viktor Yanukovych, the former president of Ukraine, boarded a flight bound for political exile in Russia, something else was going on down in southern Ukraine. That something was the opening of the still very much ongoing Russo-Ukrainian War, which saw little green men, troops in unmarked green army uniforms, take over the Verkhovna Rada, or Supreme Council, aka Crimea's parliament, on February 27th. This eventually paved the way for Russia's annexation of Crimea on March 18th, but importantly for us, a channel about ghost countries, it's in the name, there was, technically speaking, a breakaway republic mixed up in all this, the very short-lived Republic of Crimea. Located on the northern coast of the Black Sea, the Crimean or Tauric Peninsula, as it was known in antiquity, is roughly 10,425 square miles or 27,000 square kilometers, making it slightly bigger than Rwanda for size comparison. Its only land border is the narrow Isthmus of Perekop, which connects Crimea with Ukraine's Kherson Oblast. Sandwiched between this and the Arabat Spit, you'll find a rather large system of lagoons called the Sivash, which literally means dirt. Also known as the Putrid or Rotten Sea, the shallow brackish waters of the lagoon heat up during summer months, producing a, putrid smell. The peninsula's eastern tip, over here, is separated from the Russian mainland by the Kerch Strait, which also forms the boundary between the Sea of Azov and Black Sea. By the early Iron Age, Taurians, or Tauri, and East Iranian-speaking Scythians had settled in Crimea. The two groups eventually intermixed over time, becoming the so-called Tario-Scythians noted by ancient Greek writers in the 3rd century BC. And I thought it was probably just worth mentioning, the Taurians, at least according to the Greeks, were particularly well known for, human sacrifice, especially among any shipwrecked sailors or Greeks that they would capture during various sea raids. As described by Herodotus, the Taurians would beat the head of a person to be sacrificed with a club, later removing the head entirely. Their body would then either be burned or thrown from a cliff. The head, though, was to be affixed to a cross or pole outside Taurian places of worship. The Greeks arrived on the peninsula, establishing colonies like Pantekapion along its southern coast in either the 7th or 6th century BC. In time, a Greco-Scythian state known as the Bosporan Kingdom was formed, the first truly Hellenistic state in that it had an ethnically diverse population that adopted Greek language and culture. Following the Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, various other successor states like the Empire of Trebizond and Principality of Theodoro, and even the Republic of Genoa would rule the Crimea at one point or another, before it was finally absorbed by the Ottoman Empire in the late 15th century. Russian claims to the Crimea date back as far as the Russo-Turkish War of 1768-1774, when, following its defeat, the Ottoman Empire was forced to relinquish control over the Crimean Khanate. The Khanate, which since 1475 had been an Ottoman protectorate, thereafter became a nominally independent state under considerable Russian influence. Crimean Tatars, a Turkic people who by this point made up the majority of the population, had no desire for independence, however, and soon dispatched envoys to negotiate the Khanate's re-entry into the Ottoman Empire. In response, Russia invaded the Crimea in November 1776, installing Sahin Garay, the last Khan of Crimea. Following a series of revolts by Crimean Tatars, though, Russian forces were again called in, eventually annexing the Crimea on April 18, 1783. It was thereafter incorporated as part of the newly created Taurida Oblast. And here it remained until the Russian Revolution of 1917. But long story short, from this point on, Crimea was very much a part of Russia. St. Petersburg's control over Crimea was reaffirmed in the Russo-Turkish War of 1787 to 1792, in which the Ottoman Empire attempted, unsuccessfully mind you, to regain territories it had lost in the previous decades. It was also around this time the Black Sea Fleet made its debut, defeating the Turkish fleet at the Battle of Kerch Strait in 1790, thereby preventing the landing of an Ottoman ground force in Crimea. Officially founded in May 1783 and based out of the city of Sevastopol, the Black Sea Fleet would in many ways come to represent the spearhead of Russian foreign policy in the Mediterranean, partaking in the siege of Corfu, defeating the Turkish fleet once again at the Battle of the Dardanelles, and helping secure Greek independence from the Ottoman Empire during the appropriately named Greek War of Independence. Restrictions placed upon the Black Sea Fleet by Ottoman control of the Bosporus Strait, alongside other factors, including Russian actions which threatened the regional balance of power, would, however, see the British and French intervene on behalf of the so-called sick man of Europe during the Crimean War, which eventually saw the occupation of Sevastopol after a costly one-year siege. Following this, Russia sued for peace, and with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in March 1856, the Black Sea essentially became a demilitarized region. This did not make things easy during the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, but in part owing to a diplomatic tit-for-tat with Prussia, Russia was able to gain international recognition for its denouncement of Article 11 of the Treaty of Paris, thus allowing it to revive the Black Sea Fleet. In the early 20th century, the Crimea, or at least the waters around the peninsula, would play an instrumental role in the Russian Revolution of 1905, when the crew aboard the Potemkin, a Russian battleship then at gunnery practice off the Tendris Spit, refused to eat borscht made from rotten meat partially infested with maggots in June of that year. Oh, and in case you were wondering, the meat had been approved for consumption by the ship's senior surgeon. This, of course, was not the only reason for what occurred. News of the disastrous Battle of Tsushima had been received just a few weeks prior, a humiliating defeat in which Russia lost all of its battleships alongside most of its cruisers and destroyers. Tsushima effectively concluded the Russo-Japanese War in the latter's favor, costing some 4,380 Russian sailors their lives, while 5,917 had been captured and a further 1,862 were interned. Enough was enough for the disillusioned crew, and soon a full-scale mutiny had broken out aboard the Potemkin. The mutineers killed 7 of the ship's 18 officers, including Captain Evgeny Gilikov, before capturing a torpedo boat, the Ismail, that had been accompanying the Potemkin. The ship then headed to Odessa, flying a red flag, where it refused to help in putting down a general strike then occurring in the city. Eventually, 2 squadrons of the Black Sea Fleet were sent to either force the Potemkin's crew to surrender or sink the ship. The mutineers managed to escape, however, and made their way to Constanta, Romania, where they aimed to restock food, water, and coal. The Romanians refused to supply them, and instead they sailed back to Crimea. From here, the Potemkin sailed back to Constanta, where the mutineers were now offered asylum if they disarmed and surrendered the battleship under their control, which following a vote they did. The Ismail, though, opted to sail back to Sevastopol, where its crew later turned themselves in. As mentioned in another episode, subtle plug I know, World War I did not go very well for Russia. It fueled the Revolution of 1917, which itself spilled over into the Russian Civil War. And it was during this chaos the short-lived Crimean People's Republic popped up. Yeah, just like that. Proclaimed on December 13, 1917, following a Kurultai of 76 Crimean Tatar delegates. A Kurultai being a political military council of chiefs and or khans derived from the Proto-Mongolic word meaning to collect or gather, the republic was, technically speaking, the first Turkic and Muslim democratic republic anywhere in the world. An all-Crimean constitutional assembly was then convened and a provisional government established. However, not unaware of events occurring in Crimea, Bolshevik forces who controlled much of the country then captured Sevastopol, transferring power to a local revolutionary committee, or Revcom. The upstart Crimean People's Republic did not go down without a fight though, mustering a force of about 1,000 men, and several clashes with the Bolsheviks, now supported by elements of the Black Sea Fleet, took place throughout January 1918. On January 14th, Simferopol fell, and the Republic's president, Noman Jelebi-Chihan, who despite having resigned his office 10 days prior, was taken to Sevastopol and executed without trial on February 23rd. His body was then thrown into the sea, and with Celebi Cihan's death, the Crimean People's Republic was replaced by the pro-Bolshevik Taurida Soviet Socialist Republic. However, this ghost country proved short-lived too, with the German Empire assisting forces of the Ukrainian People's Republic, under command of Petro Bolbochin, in capturing the peninsula during the so-called Crimean Operation. By April 1918, most of the leadership of the Taurida Soviet Socialist Republic had either fled or been killed by Crimean Tatar insurgents, and on April 30th, the SSR was officially abolished. The Crimean Regional Government was then established on June 25th under the leadership of a Lipka Tatar, Maciej Sulkowicz. A bit off topic, but the Lipka, or Polish-Lithuanian Tatars, are an ethnic group who, seeking to preserve their shamanistic religion, sought refuge among the non-Christian population of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania sometime at the beginning of the 14th century. As Prime Minister, Sulkowicz realized that under the protectorate status conferred by Germany, he had very little practical authority. As in Ukraine, the Germans enacted harsh measures on the peasantry to produce grain that was then shipped back to war-torn Germany. Originally, grain shipments were to be transferred over land, but the advancing Red Army made such shipments risky, and therefore Crimea was essential for shipping grain by sea. Talks were held with Ukraine about creating a federative relationship, but on November 25th, as German troops withdrew from Crimea, Sulkowicz was replaced by Solomon Krim, a Crimean Khanate and former member of the Constitutional Democratic Party, which had promoted adoption of a Western-style constitutional monarchy, among other things, in the now-defunct Russian Empire. In late December, Allied troops landed in Crimea as part of the French-led Southern Russia intervention, which aimed to assist the White Movement, a loose collection of anti-Bolshevik forces in Russia's then ongoing civil war. Following the loss of Odessa in April 1919, however, they withdrew, paving the way for the Red Army's retaking of the peninsula. In May, the Crimean Socialist Soviet Republic was proclaimed, only to be snuffed out by white forces under command of Anton Denkin, who landed near Koktebel on June 18th. Crimea was thereafter controlled by the South Russian government, which later became the government of South Russia, until it was again retaken by the Red Army in November 1920 following the siege of Perekop. During the chaos, Pyotr Wrangel, commanding general of the White Army in the region, oversaw a mass evacuation of some 145,693 people from the Crimea, who feared reprisals by the advancing Red Army. Despite a promise of amnesty, Lenin would later okay a campaign of political repression and extrajudicial killings across Russia, known as the Red Terror, which in Crimea saw between 50,000 and 100,000 people executed for their supposed association with the anti-Bolshevik White Movement. Much of this was organized by a Hungarian communist known as Béla Kun, who, coincidentally, was also the leader of another short-lived ghost country, the Hungarian Soviet Republic, which lasted for about 3 months back in 1919. Following the Red Terror, the peninsula became the Crimean Autonomous Socialist Soviet Republic of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic on October 18, 1921. It was later renamed in 1936 as the Crimean Autonomous Socialist Soviet Republic. But another war loomed on the horizon that would see chaos throughout the newly established Soviet Union, including the Crimean Peninsula.